Okay, this is Natives of Alaska. Again, part two on the Aleutian Islands and the Aleuts. So we talked a little bit about archaeology, but you do need to know a little bit more about the prehistory of Alaska and of the Aleutians. So the oldest site in the Aleutians is Anangula. It's 8,000 years old. It's on Umnak Island, and what they found were permanent houses that had then been abandoned. So this was a really big deal because we don't find a lot of old sites in Alaska, and we don't find a lot of them in the Aleutians. So here are some of the artifacts. They found seal oil lamps. So what you're looking at is a picture of a seal oil lamp. What they would do is they would take vertebra and different kinds of materials and then fill it with moss, use whale oil, and then light it. They used carved stone dishes, and they had grinding stones. Here are some of the other artifacts found. Some of them are more primitive than others, but again, this is a very old site. Then we have Chaluka Village. Now this shows 4,000 years of continuous occupation. Continuous occupation means that people lived there for 4,000 years. It was one of 22 villages on Umnak Island, and they found harpoons, spearheads, what could be images of a deity, and here you have pictures of grinding stones and mortars that they used for various herbs and whatever they were making. Here are all kinds of fishhook shanks and spearheads that they found at the site. So again, definitely a maritime adaptation. Look at this, a driftwood shovel and a whalebone lamp. So again, here you have the seal oil lamp, and this is what they used as a shovel. They didn't have metal, don't forget. Here's more items that they found. Bone needles for sewing, root diggers. And then there you have a lot of decorative items. Again, are these pictures of deities? Are they dolls? I mean, we're not really sure what they are, what their representations are of. And then here you have harpoons and socket sets. Here's a really big lamp. And every year they sponsor archaeological digs out in the Aleutians. So here's pictures from one year. Now, one of your assignments is going to be to look up information on the Macnac Bridge site. So here is some of the excavation that was going on. This is a really big, important site. Here's part of a mast that was found. Okay, so in order to understand the history of contact in the Aleutians, you need to know about the discovery, and I say that in quotation marks, of the Aleutians by the Russians. Because the Aleutian history is actually tied to the Russians, and what you're seeing there is the double-headed crest of Russia. These were all in gold, and there are still some that haven't been found up here in Alaska that were buried. Okay, so our journey starts with Vitus Bering. Bering was a Danish Navy officer in the Russian Navy, and he was ordered by Tsar Peter the Great to investigate the waters east of Siberia. And so he set out, because don't forget, they didn't know what was out there. This first voyage was in 1727. And, these were the days when people thought there were all kinds of sea monsters, that you're going to fall off the face of the earth. So he had no idea what he was getting into. And he discovered the Bering Straits, and if you're going to find something, you might as well name it after yourself, right? He also found St. Lawrence Island. So then he went back to Russia. And the Tsar ordered a second voyage. Now this is a really important date, 1741. You have two ships setting out, the St. Peter and the St. Paul. Bering was the captain of the St. Peter. George Steller was the ship's doctor on that ship. And Cherikov was the captain of the St. Paul. So they set out, again, they were supposed to chart the waters past Siberia. Well, okay, wrong cruise. So they set out on a cruise. And I have to interject here that as everything we can tell from Steller, he was a real character. He was a brilliant scientist, but he was kind of a jerk to his crewmates. He had just gotten married, and you have to remember, or if you don't know, St. Petersburg at the time was called the Paris of the North. So it was very posh, very affluent, the high society. Here this woman thinks she married a doctor. Oh boy, her life's going to be cheese or cream cheese. And then he says he's going off to Siberia. And so she left him. And, was he devastated? Was he not? What he said he would shift his love to the study of the Siberian environment. And it came to pass that he was really, really big on taking notes and drawing all the things he saw. And his notes have become invaluable to piecing together the first couple of contacts with any of the Aleutian Islanders. Okay, this is a little joke if you don't, some of you are too young to know Boris and Natasha, but whatever. Okay, back to the real story. So their mission was to continue to chart the unknown waters. The two ships were not together long. They were supposed to use the buddy ship. After 16 days, they got separated. They got in a storm, and they were never reunited, never saw each other again. We know what happened because the St. Peter's log was saved. Bering's crew was sailing aimlessly without knowing where they were going. They had drifted off course. However, from Steller's notes, we have an account of the first sighting of Alaska natives. So here you have what Alaska natives look like. Now, how would you feel if you were Russian and if you were Alaska native? So basically, this is the first account. What happened was they heard people screaming, and they came up to a skin boat. It says, "We," said Steller, "again signaled to them to come to us, and the same time cried out Nietzsche," which, according to the translator, meant water. The natives repeated this word several times and again pointed to the land as if promising to give water, because they were out in one of their kayaks in the middle of the ocean. One of them came near to the ship, took from his bosom a piece of a kind of clay of the color of iron or lead, and besmeared his cheeks with it, and then drove bunches of grasses in his nostrils, through the nasal wings of which were thin bones. Behind the Aleut, which at that time they just called him the American, in his skin boat lay several sticks of pine wood, in which were like in shape to billiard sticks, a fathom long and painted red. He took with his hand one of the sticks, and laughing, threw it into the sea before our ship. I cannot say as an offering or as a token of friendship. In reply to this, we attached to a small board 2 Chinese smoking pipes and some Chinese beads, and threw them to him. He took the presents, looked at them a little, and delivered them to his companion, who put them in his skin boat. After this, the native became more competent, came nearer to the ship, although with a certain caution, tied a complete skin of a hawk to another stick, and gave it to our interpreter. Now, don't forget, the interpreter only knew Siberian Eskimo languages. They had no idea what the Aleut language was. A mirror and a piece of silk were thrown to him. After receiving the president's boats, Aleut began to paddle back to the shore by signs inviting the Russians to follow them. All the time the two islanders were near us and our ship, their companions on the shore continued to cry out loudly for some unknown reason. So this is, as far as we can tell, the first encounter between Russians and Aleuts. So during this time period, they were sailing aimlessly and they hit some of the other islands. There were several incidents, one during which some of the Russians went in a skiff, including Stellar, and they hid weapons underneath some tarps. So as they were going to an island, all these natives were screaming on the edge, and some of the men waded out through the water and grabbed hold of the rope of the skiff. And the Russians started freaking out because they didn't know what was happening. They didn't know if they were going to be killed. They took out their lances and sabers that had been covered with canvas. They also took out pilot bread, brandy, and other things as presents, but they were too freaked out. So what the Russians ended up doing was they ended up firing their rifles. And that totally scared the Aleuts. They had never heard rifles before, and the Aleuts just went running back. And then as they pulled away, they started, meaning the Russians, they started throwing spears at them. There was another incident where natives came closer to a Russian skiff because they're just wandering around all these islands, and they tried to give the native vodka. And this is what Stellar wrote. This drink, says Stellar, not known before to the natives, was disagreeable to the guest. After spitting out the vodka, he cried out loudly as if complaining of having been badly treated, and there was no way to pacify him. He was given needles, beads, an iron kettle, tobacco pipes, and other things, but he took nothing, wishing only to be allowed to go ashore, which he was permitted to do. So understand that there were all these encounters. There was another encounter where the Russians, again, tried to get close to an island. The islanders pulled them in, and the Russians actually killed two of them because they got really afraid and they didn't know what was going on. What we do know is that, this is September. In the Aleutians, September, the waters started getting rougher, storms were coming. So the St. Peter lifted anchor to try to return home. But they had no idea where they were going. They were lost. They hit all kinds of severe weather. By October, they were still at sea and they were lost. Sharks were circling the boat, and according to the ship's log, men were dying of scurvy. Bering started getting sick. We know that by October, 12 men had died. Now, the interesting thing is Stellar, who was the ship's doctor, was supposed to be treating the men, but he was such a jerk, he didn't want to be bothered, so he was not well liked. He had temper tantrums. And by November 7th of 1941, land was sighted. This became known of what is now Bering Island. By this time, Bering was sick. Bering died on January 8th. And of the 77 men of the crew, 31 had died on Bering Island. So the ship had pretty much gotten wrecked due to the lack of ports or any available place to put the boat into. So what the men had to do was they had to live on this island for 10 months. They lived in dugout holes. They covered them with sails. They used driftwood for fuel. But they hunted sea otters and fur seals and sea cows. And they had more than 700 sea otters that they kept, and they kept the skins. They had Arctic foxes. So during those 10 months, they were able to survive off of the sea mammals. And during this time, Bering had a field day. He was going around drawing pictures of different species, and he kept notes on everything. So here you can actually see there's a jay called the Stellar jay. There's the Stellar sea lion. There's one of his original drawings. In the meantime, remember the ship, the St. Paul. Well, they made it back to Siberia in December of 1741, and in May in 1742, they went out looking for Bering. Well, what we know now is they went right by the Bering Island where all the men were, but they didn't know it was inhabited, so they were pretty much useless. In August of 1742, the survivors of the St. Peter built a new boat out of what was left of the old boat, and they eventually made it back to Siberia. Everyone marveled at the furs they brought back with them. And that was the beginning of the end for the Aleuts, because when the Russians saw the furs, everybody went wild and they said, okay, we got to go back and get more of these furs. So what became of Stellar? Here you can read this on your own, but basically it's kind of sad. The final 4 years of his life, the hot-tempered Stellar spent exploring and collecting, that should be plants and animals, in Siberia. He ran afoul of the Tsar's bureaucracy when he angrily released 17 Siberian natives he thought had been unfairly arrested by some petty official. For this, Stellar was eventually arrested, imprisoned, and tried and finally released. But paperwork moved slowly, as Stellar himself headed back to St. Petersburg to write and publish his findings. He was again arrested on the original charge. By that time, he was freed a second time, his health was broken, and he became fatally ill as he tried to reach St. Petersburg. He was only 37 years old when he died.